Good morning, everyone. When it comes to health, I personally believe that we tend to overcomplicate things. What I mean by this is that it's much easier to blame our health problems on something complex, like hormone imbalances or brain chemical deficiencies or even poor genetics, rather than looking or rather than focusing on a lack of consistency in practicing or executing the foundations of health, such as optimizing nutrient status or improving personal fitness or working on our emotional health and our personal relationships. And this is why I'm always promoting the basics of health and why I really do believe that we should start there before complicating things for ourselves. Now, all that said, I'd like to discuss the best health advice that no one really seems to talk about. And this really comes down to two specific ions or nutrients known as sodium and potassium. Potassium and sodium are absolutely essential for life. Every single cell in our body contains these special doors or channels that allow sodium and potassium to enter and exit. And these are called sodium-potassium channels. Now, these channels act very much like tiny molecular pumps that pull potassium into the cell, and they also force sodium out, which then creates a chemical battery. This is literally what drives the transmission of signals along your nerves, and it also powers the contraction of our muscles. Now, it's not just that. These sodium-potassium channels are very, very important for life. They're important for energy production. Like I said, they generate action potentials. Literally, they're like batteries creating energy. They play a major role in fluid balance, which absolutely, again, it impacts our kidneys. It plays a role with our blood and with circulation. So, I'm sure at some point you've been told that you should limit your salt intake. For the most part, it's true. I mean, salt or sodium can absolutely cause all sorts of problems for some people, but not everyone. More important than sodium is actually potassium. In fact, if I were potassium, I'd fire my publicist because it doesn't really get the attention that it deserves. I mean, you hardly ever really hear that you should eat more potassium. Instead, people are way more likely to say things like you should really cut back on sodium. And again, I also think sodium should probably fire its publicist as well. Now, why am I talking about these two nutrients? Because when it comes to blood pressure or heart health, getting enough potassium is way more important than decreasing your sodium intake. In fact, a new Boston University study, which was published just at the beginning of this year, reported that people who consumed higher amounts of potassium, but not lower sodium, had reduced rates of cardiovascular disease. Now, more magnesium was also shown to be beneficial, but what's frustrating is that this is not a new finding at all. This finding is actually right in line with what previous research has shown for years, even though most people haven't really heard about it. Or, like I said, you hardly ever get any attention from it. Again, I do believe potassium needs a new publicist. Now, in this video, I'd like to break it down for you to help you to understand a little bit more about sodium and potassium. Now, let's start with some background. Here's a statement from scientists at the National Institutes of Health, the NIH, and the United States Department of Agriculture. And I'm going to read this. I quote, "Recent data suggest that the dietary sodium to potassium ratio is more strongly associated with an increased risk of hypertension and cardiovascular disease-related mortality than the risk associated from either sodium or potassium alone." Again, let me read that. Recent data suggests that the dietary sodium to potassium ratio is more strongly associated with an increased risk of hypertension and cardiovascular disease-related mortality than the risk associated from either sodium or potassium alone. Again, the combination of these two. So according to this research, the real key is to get the right balance of sodium and potassium. Now, what would that look like, or what is that exactly? To figure this out, we first need to look at the current dietary recommendations for sodium and potassium. Now, these numbers are from the Institute of Medicine's Food and Nutrition Board. They say that 2.4 grams or 2,400 milligrams of sodium per day, that's basically what we should be shooting for, 4,700 milligrams of potassium per day, or 4.7 grams. As you can see, it's advised that you really should be getting twice as much potassium as sodium. So the ideal balance or the ratio would be somewhere between 1 to 2 of sodium to potassium. In other words, twice as much potassium as sodium. Or if you want to get technical, it's 0.49. Now, is this realistic? Well, the NIH USDA scientists noted that Americans on average rarely even come close to that half ratio or the 0.49 ratio. There's this one study that they cited where it looked at Americans' diets from 1971 all the way up to 1996. And it showed that the sodium to potassium ratio was never less than 0.83. That's pretty crazy. I mean, no wonder heart disease is the leading cause of death in this country. And again, going back to the basics and how we complicate things, of course, when we think about heart disease, you're going to think about blood pressure, you're going to think about cholesterol, all these other things. But keep in mind that there's very strong data to suggest that something as simple as your sodium to potassium ratio being off is a primary driver for heart disease in this country. Now, the good news, other research shows a reduced risk of heart disease and death for people who achieved less than a 1-to-1 ratio. This is a long way of saying most people probably won't ever get to a 1-to-2 ratio, but that's okay because they can still benefit by working on increasing the amount of potassium that they take in. Now let's look at the opportunity here. On average, Americans consume 3,600 milligrams of sodium per day and 2,800 milligrams of potassium per day. That's a sodium to potassium ratio of 1 to 3. It's completely, it's almost opposite, right? We're getting way more sodium than potassium. And what I'm telling you is that we should be getting double the amount of potassium than sodium. So again, we really just need to be thinking about this is how do we correct it? Well, to achieve a lower than 1-to-1 ratio, a person could either cut back on sodium, or you can just add or focus on increasing potassium, or maybe do a little bit of both. In theory, either could help you to improve your health. And that's where this most recent study comes in. It suggests that if you had to choose, emphasizing more potassium would actually be the best option. Now, the scientists followed over 2,000 people, ages 30 to 64, and they tracked their eating and health data over 12 years. So this is a pretty good study. And when the study started, none of these people had cardiovascular disease. And what was their big finding? Well, the more potassium that people ate, the lower their risk of cardiovascular disease or events. Specifically, the risk was elevated at potassium intakes of less than 2,500 milligrams, but began to drop once people were eating more than that. Now, a similar trend was also seen in magnesium intakes. And there's some graphs here that I'm providing for you. And basically, these graphs show you what's called a hazards ratio. The higher the hazards ratio, the worse off the outcome. And you'll notice here that as we increase the intakes of magnesium, or as we increase the intakes of potassium, the hazard ratio drops. Interestingly, you don't see the same for sodium. So in fact, increasing sodium didn't seem to change that hazard ratio much. So again, the good news here is that we just need to focus on increasing our magnesium and increasing our potassium to try to balance out the amount of that ratio. Now, for this mineral, risk was higher at intakes of less than 240 milligrams and lower for those consuming even greater amounts. But like I said, no trend was seen with sodium intake. Eating more or less didn't seem to have an effect on risk over the 12-year period. Also, no trend was seen for calcium intake either. So what's the big takeaway here? Well, diet culture is often about telling people what they shouldn't eat. But in this case, you can simply focus, like I'm saying, on adding more potassium and magnesium-rich foods, which basically means fruits, vegetables, starchy tubers, and healthy fats. There's really no downside here because the best sources are whole, minimally processed foods. A few examples would include things like pork, potatoes, squash, spinach, butternut squash, kiwi fruit, clams, cantaloupes, pumpkin seeds, which are abundant in magnesium, grapefruits, milk, carrots, split peas, cauliflower. All of these foods are really good sources of magnesium and potassium. Finally, this study showed that higher intakes of potassium and magnesium, not lower intake of sodium, reduced heart disease. Now, I'm not saying that you should avoid salt, but at the same time, avoiding ultra-processed foods, anything that's packaged in a box or in a package, right? Anything that is wrapped, and not drowning your food in salt is maybe something that we can focus on. But at the end of the day, again, I think it's good news that you can just focus on adding food rather than taking away. So if you can, I would challenge you to try to add foods that contain potassium, because again, the data is pretty clear. By increasing your potassium relative to sodium, you're going to improve your state of health. And this is also why with functional blood chemistry, we calculate your sodium to potassium ratio. And for any of you that have already had that analysis, and you can go back and look at your blood chemistry, you'll see, what your level is there. And if you see that that's off, well, certainly we need to work on increasing our potassium levels. All right, I hope this information is useful. And as always, go out today and really try to focus on doing good things.